The air in the Grand Cathedral was heavy with the scent of 5,000 imported lilies, a cloying sweetness that now felt like a funeral shroud. 6 months of meticulous planning, 2 billion won dynasties, and 200 of the most powerful people in the country sat in a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Tae-Rin Jeong stood at the altar, his silhouette sharp against the stained glass, a man carved from cold obsidian. Beside him, Sui Mok was a vision of engineered perfection in a lace gown that had taken a dozen seamstresses a quarter of a year to finish. She had just begun to reach for his hand when he spoke. "I can't do this." The words weren't shouted. They were delivered with the same terrifying, quiet precision Tae-Rin used when he was deciding the fate of a rival territory. The priest froze, the prayer book trembling slightly in his grip. Sui didn't break, not yet. Her social training was a suit of armor. She leaned in, her voice a frantic, low-frequency hiss. "Tae-Rin. Not here. Think about the merger. Think about our fathers." "I am thinking about what I saw," Tae-Rin replied, finally turning his head to look at her. His eyes were devoid of the heat of anger, there was only a chilling, clinical disappointment. "I know what you did at the estate. I know what you did to her." A flicker of something ugly and panic darted across Sui's face before being replaced by a sneer of pure, aristocratic disdain. "You're stopping all of this, for a maid? For a girl who cleans your floors? She's nothing, Tae-Rin. She's a ghost in a uniform." "She was the only thing in that house that was real," he said, his voice dropping to a level that made the front row of guests lean back. "And you tried to break her because you couldn't stand the fact that she didn't fear me. Or you." The murmur started then, a low ripple of shock traveling through the pews like a wave. Sui's hands began to shake, the silk of her bouquet rustling. "You're choosing a nobody over me? You'll be a laughingstock." Tae-Rin didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply looked at his best man, Seon-hun, who gave a single, somber nod. Tae-Rin stepped off the dais, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, the only sound in a room that had just witnessed the death of an empire. He walked past his father, past the cameras, and past the open doors, leaving that perfect life behind. He wasn't walking toward a scandal, he was walking toward the only person who had ever looked at him and seen a man instead of a title. The flashback began 8 months before the ruin at the altar, in the cold, sterile silence of the Jeong estate's private medical wing. It was 2:14 a.m. when the heavy double doors hissed open, admitting a chaotic trail of blood and the frantic, heavy breathing of armed men. Imani Nwosu didn't flinch. While the other domestic staff retreated into the shadows of the hallway, she stepped directly into the path of the violence. On the gurney lay Seon-hun, Tae-Rin's most loyal commander, his chest a map of jagged lacerations and deep, pulsing arterial spray. The estate's primary physician was still 10 minutes away, caught behind a security lockdown. His flatlining, one of the guards shouted, his hand shaking as he tried to apply pressure. "Do something." Imani didn't ask for permission. She didn't explain that before she had come to this country for a fresh start, she had spent for years in a high-volume trauma unit in Lagos. She simply moved. With a clinical detachment that bordered on the supernatural, she grabbed a pair of surgical shears from the emergency kit and sliced through Seon-hun's tactical vest. The room was a blur of black suits and panic, but Imani was a point of absolute stillness. Her fingers, dark and steady against the pale, blooded skin of the commander, found the source of the hemorrhage. She didn't have a vascular clamp, so she used her own forceps, a pair of steady hands and a curved hemostat. "I need suction and a chest tube," she said, her voice a calm, low-frequency command that sliced through the noise. "Now." When the guards hesitated, a shadow fell over the room. Tae-Rin Jeong had entered. He didn't speak, he simply watched the woman in the maid's uniform. He saw the way she didn't look up at him, the way she ignored his power and his presence entirely because a life was more important than a title. With a definitive click, Imani clamped the bleeder. The frantic rhythm of the heart monitor stabilized into a slow, stubborn thrum. She worked for another 6 minutes, her white apron stained a deep crimson, her movements economical and precise. By the time the lead doctor burst into the room, the crisis had passed. Imani finally stepped back, her chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled breath. She didn't look for praise. She reached for a basin of water to begin cleaning the floor. It was only then that she realized Tae-Rin was still there, leaning against the doorframe, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a question. For the first time in his life, Tae-Rin wasn't looking at a servant. He was looking at the only person in his world who knew exactly who she was without needing to say a word. 3 nights later, the rain was a steady, rhythmic drumming against the tinted windows of Tae-Rin's sedan. He sat in the back seat, the engine idling in a low, predatory hum, parked just outside the staff entrance of the estate's medical wing. His security team had suggested he go inside, to wait in the climate-controlled comfort of his study, but Tae-Rin had declined. He wanted to see her come out. He wanted to see her before she knew she was being watched. When the heavy steel door finally opened, Imani stepped out, pulling a dark knit sweater over her uniform. She looked exhausted, her shoulders carrying the invisible weight of a double shift, but her stride was still purposeful. She didn't scan the perimeter for threats or look for the source of the expensive engine noise. She simply walked toward the bus stop at the edge of the property. Tae-Rin stepped out of the car. The rain immediately soaked into his silk shirt, but he didn't seem to notice. "The buses don't run at this hour, Miss Nwosu." Imani stopped. She didn't jump or gasp, she merely turned, her dark eyes finding his in the gloom. There was no flicker of the practiced subservience he received from the rest of the staff, no bowing, no frantic apologies. "Then I'll walk to the main road," she said, her voice holding that same calm, melodic frequency he had heard in the trauma bay. "The air is better out here anyway." He moved toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. "I'll have my driver take you." "It isn't a request." Imani looked at the car, then back at him. A small, tired smile played at the corners of her mouth. "You're very good at giving orders, Mr. Jeong. Does anyone ever tell you no?" "Regularly," he lied. "But they usually regret it." "I don't think I would," she replied softly. She didn't move toward the car. Instead, she leaned against the damp brick of the gatehouse, looking out at the sprawling, rain-slicked gardens. It must be lonely, living in a place where everyone is just a reflection of what you want to see. Tae-Rin felt a strange, sharp pang in his chest, a sudden hairline fracture in his carefully maintained armor. Everyone else performed for him. They played the role of the loyal soldier, the fearful servant, or the ambitious ally. But Imani stood there in the rain, treating him like a man who was simply standing in her way. "You didn't perform the other night," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "When the blood was on your hands. You didn't even look at me." "I was busy," she said simply. Life doesn't wait for a title to be acknowledged. For the first time in years, Tae-Rin didn't feel like a boss or a monster. He felt seen. They stood in the rain for a long moment, the silence between them heavy not with tension, but with a rare, terrifying honesty. 40 minutes, he said finally. "The car will get you home in 40 minutes. Please?" She studied him, searching for the hidden hook in his words. Finding none, she nodded. 40 minutes sounds like a luxury, Mr. Jeong." The 40 minutes became a recurring anchor in a world that usually shifted beneath Tae-Rin's feet. Over the next 3 months, the gap between the Mafia boss and the maid didn't vanish, but it transformed into a private sanctuary. Their connection wasn't built on grand declarations or expensive jewelry, those were the tools of the performance, but on the quiet, steady exchange of truth. It began with small gestures that bypassed the estate's rigid hierarchy. Tae-Rin began leaving the study door ajar on Tuesday nights, not because he needed his tea refreshed, but because he knew Imani would be the one to bring it. He stopped reading the endless stream of logistics reports when she entered, replaced instead by a silence that invited her to speak. He learned that she missed the specific, earthy scent of the rain in Lagos and that she found the silence of his massive library too loud. In return, she learned that the most powerful man in the city couldn't sleep without a light on in the hallway, a lingering habit from a childhood spent in shadows. "You're doing it again," Imani said one evening, placing a tray on the mahogany desk. Tae-Rin looked up from a map of the shipping docks. "Doing what?" "Wearing your title like a heavy coat," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Your jaw is set so tight I'm surprised you can still speak. Drink the tea before it goes cold, Tae-Rin." He reached for the cup, his fingers briefly brushing hers. It was a standard physical contact, yet it felt like an electric current. "People pay millions to hear my advice, Imani. You're the only person who treats me like a patient who won't follow orders." "Because you are," she replied, leaning against the edge of the desk, a gesture that would have been a firing offense for anyone else. "Everyone else sees the boss. I see the man who hasn't had a full night's sleep in 3 months." Honesty was their currency. Tae-Rin found himself telling her things he hadn't even admitted to his advisors, the crushing weight of a legacy he hadn't asked for, and the fear that he was becoming the very monster his father had trained him to be. Imani listened without judgment, her presence a cool cloth on a fevered brow. She didn't offer platitudes, she offered perspective. They met in the garden at dawn, in the medical wing during the quiet hours, and in the shared silence of the car rides home. To the rest of the world, they were moving in their predetermined orbits. But in the secret spaces between the shadows, they were becoming the only real thing in each other's lives. For the first time, Tae-Rin wasn't looking at a contract or a merger. He was looking at a future that didn't feel like a prison. The engagement to Sui Mok had never been a matter of the heart, it was a matter of mathematics. In the world Tae-Rin inhabited, marriage was the final signature on a merger, a way to weave two vast, dark empires into a single, unbreakable cord. On paper, it was flawless. The Mok family controlled the logistics and the ports, the Jeong family controlled the capital and the streets. Together, they would be an undisputed sovereign state within the city. Sui was the perfect candidate for this union, a woman raised in the same cold, high-altitude air as Tae-Rin. She understood the language of power and the necessity of keeping one's hands clean while others did the dirty work. To their parents, the match was a masterpiece of strategic planning. To the society pages, it was the romance of the century. But to Tae-Rin, sitting across from her at silent, multi-course dinners, it felt like staring into a mirror that only reflected his own emptiness. "The guest list has reached 400, Tae-Rin," Sui had said during one of those sterile evenings, her voice as sharp and polished as the diamonds on her neck. She didn't look at him as she spoke, she was too busy reviewing a seating chart that looked more like a battlefield map. "Your father insists on the Prime Minister's presence. It's about the optics of legitimacy." Optics, Tae-Rin had repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Is there anything about this day that is actually about us, Sui?" She had looked up then, her expression one of genuine, chilling confusion. "Us? We are the sum of our assets, Tae-Rin. This wedding is the coronation. Don't be sentimental, it doesn't suit a man of your position." In that moment, he realized that Sui didn't just accept the performance, she thrived in it. She viewed people as variables to be managed and emotions as weaknesses to be exploited. There was no real beneath her surface, only layers of calculated grace and a terrifyingly hollow ambition. She didn't want a husband, she wanted a partner in a monopoly. Every time he left her presence, the silence of his car felt heavier. He would return to the estate and find himself looking for the warmth of the medical wing or the honest, unpolished scent of Imani's tea. The contrast was becoming a physical ache. On one side was a life built of paper and ink, a gilded cage with a woman who saw him only as a title. On the other was a woman who saw him as a man, and for whom he would gladly set the paper world on fire just to keep the smoke from reaching her. The bubble they had built in the quiet hours of the estate did not burst with a bang, it dissolved under the cold, clinical light of a Sunday morning newspaper. Imani had been sitting in her small, sun-drenched kitchen, the scent of hibiscus tea in the air, when she saw it. The society pages featured a full-page spread of the wedding of the century. There, in high-definition ink, was Tae-Rin, looking every bit the cold, untouchable monarch, standing beside a woman whose smile was as sharp as a diamond. The text was a litany of strategic alignment and dynastic union. It detailed a timeline that overlapped perfectly with their late-night conversations and the quiet moments in the rain. Every word felt like a physical blow. She realized then that while she had been seeing the man, the rest of the world, and his own family, had already decided his fate. She wasn't a part of the mathematics, she was the remainder, the variable that didn't fit the equation. When Tae-Rin called that evening, she watched the phone vibrate against the wooden table until the screen went dark. She didn't feel anger. Anger required a sense of surprise. She felt a profound, hollow clarity. She was a maid who had forgotten her place, and he was a king who had forgotten his crown was a crown. For the next week, the silence she maintained was absolute. When he waited for her by the staff entrance, she took the service tunnel. When he sent Sonhun to find her, she was already gone, having swapped shifts with a morning cleaner. She stopped leaving the study door ajar. She stopped being the person who brought the tea. Tae-Rin's messages changed from casual check-ins to increasingly desperate inquiries, but Imani remained a ghost. She moved through the estate with her head down, her white apron a shield, her dark eyes fixed on the floor she polished. She told herself that the performance was for the best. If he was to be the man the papers described, he didn't need a witness to his humanity. He needed a wife who understood the optics. On the third night of her withdrawal, she found a note tucked into her locker. It wasn't on official stationery, it was a torn piece of a shipping manifest. "I am not what the papers say," it read in his jagged, precise handwriting. "Talk to me." Imani crumpled the paper and dropped it into the trash. She knew that in his world, talking changed nothing. Only power changed things, and the power in that newspaper was a force she could not fight with honesty alone. She chose the silence because it was the only thing she had left that was truly hers. The silence Imani had chosen was not a shield, it was an opening. While Tae-Rin paced his study, haunted by the sudden ghost in his hallways, Sui Mok began to operate with the cold, systematic efficiency of a predator. She did not need to confront Imani directly to destroy her. In Sui's world, the most effective way to eliminate an obstacle was to make its environment uninhabitable. The campaign began with the invisible lens, a series of manufactured discrepancies that slowly poisoned Imani's professional reputation. It started small. A shipment of delicate medical supplies for the trauma bay was reported missing, only for the empty crates to be found in the staff lockers near Imani's station. Then, a series of formal complaints appeared on the Chief of Staff's desk, citing gross negligence and unprofessional conduct. The reports were written in the sterilized, untraceable language of anonymous whistleblowers, but the intent was razor-sharp. Sui did not just want Imani gone, she wanted her erased. She spent her afternoons at the estate under the guise of wedding preparations, her eyes tracking Imani like a hawk watching a field mouse. Every time Imani passed, Sui would offer a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a silent, glittering promise of ruin. "You seem distracted, dear," Sui remarked one afternoon as Imani was resetting the tea service in the sunroom. Sui reached out, her manicured finger tracing the edge of a porcelain cup. "I've heard the staff talking. They say you've become quite forgetful lately. Misplacing inventories. Ignoring protocols. It's a shame. Good help is so hard to find, but dangerous help is impossible to keep." Imani kept her gaze fixed on the tray, her hand steady despite the cold dread pooling in her stomach. "I perform my duties as I always have, Miss Mok. Do you?" Sui leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, melodic threat. "Or have you started to think that a few late-night conversations make you more than a temporary fixture in this house?" My wedding is in 2 weeks, Imani. I am clearing away the clutter to make room for my life. Don't make yourself part of the debris. By the end of the week, the internal investigation into the missing supplies had escalated. Imani found herself summoned to HR, facing a row of stern-faced administrators who looked at her not as the woman who had saved a man's life, but as a liability on a spreadsheet. Every time she tried to defend herself, she was met with a new incident report, a paper trail of lies so dense it felt like a physical suffocating weight. Sue watched the fallout from the shadows of the gallery, satisfied. She understood that in this house, Tae-Rin's word was law, but even a king couldn't protect a servant who was proven to be a thief. The trap was set, and the beauty of it was its invisibility. To Tae-Rin, it would look like Imani was simply failing, and to Imani, it would feel like the world was finally putting her back in her place. The day of the final wedding rehearsal was a choreographed display of absolute opulence, the air thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of cold champagne. The estate's grand ballroom was filled with elite guests, investors, socialites, and high-ranking members of the Mok and Jeong families, all sipping from crystal flutes while the wedding staff moved like silent ghosts between them. Imani felt the weight of their gazes, though she kept her eyes anchored to the silver tray in her hands. She had survived the week by becoming invisible, a shadow in a white apron, but she could feel Sue's presence like a localized storm. As Imani moved toward a group of dignitaries with a fresh round of drinks, Sue stepped into her path. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, tactical interception. "Wait," Sue said, her voice cutting through the ambient chatter like a blade. Imani stopped, her posture rigid. "Yes, Miss Mok." Without warning, Sue's hand shot out, her manicured fingers clamping onto Imani's forearm with a strength that belied her delicate frame. Her nails dug into the dark fabric of the maid's uniform, pinning her in place. The guests nearby fell silent, the ripples of quiet spreading outward until the entire room was focused on the two women. "I asked for the 1996 vintage," Sue said, her voice projecting to the back of the hall. "This is the 98. Or perhaps you were too busy stealing more medical supplies to read the labels on the bottles." "The cellar master provided this tray, Miss Mok," Imani said, her voice low and steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "I am simply—" "You are simply a thief," Sue interrupted, her face contorting into a mask of righteous fury. With a violent, sudden jerk, she shoved Imani's arm. The silver tray tilted, and the crystal flute slid off the edge, shattering against the marble floor in a cacophony of exploding glass and splashing gold liquid. The room gasped. Imani stood frozen, the hem of her uniform soaked in champagne, her hand still raised where the tray had been. "Look at this mess," Sue hissed, stepping closer until she was inches from Imani's face. She didn't whisper, she wanted every witness to hear. "You think because you've spent a few nights lurking in the shadows of this house that you belong here? You are a servant. You are a footnote. You will get on your knees and you will clear this up, and then you will leave this estate and never return." Imani looked up then. She didn't look at the glass or the floor. She looked directly into Sue's eyes. She saw the desperation behind the cruelty, the fear of a woman who knew she could only hold power by crushing those who possessed something she lacked. From the balcony above, a shadow moved. Tae-Rin stood there, his hands gripped tight on the railing, his face a mask of cold, terrifying stillness. He watched as Imani slowly, with agonizing dignity, began to crouch toward the glass. He didn't move to stop her yet, but for the first time, the performance of his life didn't just feel hollow. It felt like a crime. The silence in Tae-Rin's private study was different from the silence of the ballroom. It wasn't the shocked quiet of a crowd, it was the pressurized, suffocating stillness that preceded a storm. Tae-Rin sat behind his desk, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. Seonhan stood across from him, his face still bearing the faint, fading scars from the night Imani had saved his life. Without a word, the security chief placed a sleek, black tablet on the mahogany surface and slid it forward. The ballroom incident was only the end of it, sir, Seon-hun said, his voice like gravel. I took the liberty of pulling the internal feeds from the last 72 hours. Not just the public areas. The service corridors, the staff lockers, and the private gallery. Tae-Rin tapped the screen. The footage was grainy but undeniable. He watched that invisible lens manifest in real time. He saw Sue-Yi's personal assistant planting medical crates in Imani's locker while Sue-Yi watched from the end of the hall, her face a mask of bored entitlement. He watched them anonymous whistleblowers meeting with Sue-Yi in the garden to receive their instructions. Then, the footage cut to the rehearsal. He saw the high-angle view of what he had witnessed from the balcony, but with a terrifying addition, the audio. The tablet speakers picked up the wet slap of the champagne hitting the floor and Sue-Yi's voice, distorted but venomous, telling Imani she was a ghost and a footnote. He saw Imani's hand shaking as she reached for the glass, and he saw the way Sue-Yi stepped on Imani's fingers as she knelt. Tae-Rin closed his eyes, but the image remained burned into his retinas. She didn't tell me, Tae-Rin whispered, more to himself than to his chief. She wouldn't, sir, Seon-hun replied. She doesn't trade in leverage. Unlike the woman you are supposed to marry tomorrow. Tae-Rin opened his eyes. The hesitation that had plagued him for months, the avoidance through silence that had allowed this rot to grow, evaporated. He looked at the wedding itinerary sitting on his desk, a gold-embossed document detailing the merger of two empires. Cancel the security details for the Mock family, Tae-Rin said, his voice devoid of any warmth. And Seon-hun? Yes, sir. Prepare the car for tomorrow morning. But not for the church. I want to know exactly where Imani goes when she leaves this estate tonight. Don't let her see you. Just make sure she's safe. He picked up a heavy fountain pen and drew a single, thick black line through Sue-Yi's name on the marriage license. It wasn't a gesture of anger, it was a clinical removal. He had spent his life being the sum of his assets, a man defined by paper logic. But as he watched the loop of Imani standing tall amidst the shattered glass, he realized that the only asset worth keeping was the one he had nearly allowed his world to destroy. The decision was dark, final, and absolute. The merger was dead. The performance was over. That I can't do this at the altar had not been a question, it was the sound of a guillotine falling on a life made of paper. As Tae-Rin walked out of the cathedral, leaving the shattered remains of a dynasty behind him, the only thing he felt was a terrifying, exhilarating lightness. The cameras flashed, the guests whispered, and Sue-Yi's screams of indignant fury faded into the distance as the heavy oak doors slammed shut. 2 hours later, the rain was back, a steady, cleansing downpour that blurred the neon lights of the city. Tae-Rin didn't take the armored sedan. He drove himself, his silk tie discarded somewhere on the highway, his black wedding jacket rumpled and damp against his shoulders. He reached the modest apartment complex where the buses stopped, the place Imani had once told him the air was better. He stood before her door, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that no gang war or boardroom merger had ever achieved. He knocked. It wasn't the rhythmic, authoritative rap of a boss. It was hesitant. The door opened slowly. Imani stood there, her dark hair loose, wearing the same knit sweater from the night in the rain. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the expensive, ruined suit and the exhaustion etched into his face. She didn't bow. She didn't ask about the wedding. "You're late for your own coronation," she said softly, though her eyes held a glimmer of something that looked like hope. "I decided I didn't want the crown," Tae-Rin replied. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual clinical distance. "It was too heavy, and it didn't belong to me anyway." Imani leaned against the doorframe, mirroring the way he had once leaned against the gatehouse. "And what do you want now, Tae-Rin?" "A proper start," he said, stepping into the small circle of light from her hallway. "No performance. No contracts. Just 40 minutes of your time, and maybe a cup of that tea that's too honest for its own good." Imani studied him for a long moment, seeing the man who had finally become the sum of his own choices rather than his assets. A small, real smile, the kind that bypassed the dwoptics of the world, tugged at her lips. She stepped back, opening the door wide enough for him to enter. "I think I can manage 40 minutes, she said. As Tae-Rin crossed the threshold, leaving the shadows of the Jeong legacy in the hallway, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a reflection of what he wanted to see. He was home. The performance was over, and the rest of his life was finally, officially, beginning.